and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a topic which I hope to frequently return to in the future: contemporary music. Even the sound of those words can send shivers down an audience's spine, and in some ways, I can't blame them. As musicians, early training in contemporary music often occurs without a thorough and firm grounding in composition or musical aesthetics. And to make matters worse, in many cases, contemporary music is learned only as a requirement for passing certain performance examinations, as a necessary evil, so to speak. This approach does nothing to help young musicians understand what they're playing. Audiences, too, are at a significant disadvantage, again, not necessarily due to their own fault. Contemporary musical language barely exists in the common sounds we hear around us. You'll never hear it in the elevator, in the supermarket, or on television, and it's becoming more and more rare in concert or on the radio. Why should we expect an audience to fully understand something that they have no frame of reference for and little to no previous experience? What I'd like to do with this first episode on this subject is to take you through a piece which, in my view, can offer a path to understanding much of what is still happening today in contemporary art music. So, trust me, give me your hand, and together, let's step into the void. To a listener that is used to traditional harmony and counterpoint, and structure that is built on and relies on this tradition, this opening from Schönberg's Opus 11 set of 3 pieces simply sounds like it's full of wrong notes that go in the wrong direction. Furthermore, logic appears to have given way to random choices of pitch and rhythm, with seemingly no underlying theme or character. How can we listen to this? And furthermore, how can we derive meaning from it? Well, this is why you ask a pianist. Let's break this opening down. For the moment, I'd like you to forget harmony and melody and simply focus on the shapes of sounds. We have one phrase, carefully marked in dynamics and articulation, that gives the impression of moving downwards or inwards. The next part consists of 3 nearly identical statements of a musical idea, an idea that seems to do the opposite of the opening, not contract, but expand. Notice that Schönberg states this idea 3 times. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, when a composer does something 3 times, the 3rd time is usually when things change. For the third statement, Schönberg simply gives us the impression that the third time is longer, or more drawn out than the first two. I'll play it again so you can hear it. Already, we have the seeds for the ideas that follow throughout the piece. One idea contracts or gets smaller. And one idea gets larger. This tactic is no different from when Beethoven starts his Fifth Symphony with this. He uses that idea everywhere in the piece, simply in different ways. As we'll discover, Schönberg does the same. The next little section starts somewhat similar to the opening. In the beginning of the piece, we have this contracting idea. The next little section starts similarly. But then Schönberg decides to go all out with the idea of contraction versus expansion in terms of gesture. He does this. Now, this is perhaps the most obvious form of gesture that we'll get. He goes to the top, and then all the way back down. Let's be clear about this. This is not melodic, really, nor is it harmonic. It's not a broken chord, nor is it supposed to be indicative of a special rhythmic effect. It's simply moving up the keyboard and moving down. In some ways, it's no different than doing this. It's cleaner, for sure, and perhaps more precise. But that's all it is. A gesture that goes up and then down. Also, look at the pitches he uses. He makes sure to avoid anything that could inadvertently sound like a chord if we held a note too long. In other words, he's avoiding something like this. This is a choice. These are not random notes at all. They're chosen specifically to avoid any hint of tonality or chordal structure. Surprisingly, this is difficult to do, and is part of the core difficulty in our understanding of this piece. When I was playing this opening all the way through, you may have had difficulty recognizing any sort of key center. It wasn't in a major key or a minor key. It wasn't even fully diminished or augmented. The music simply existed. From the perspective of a listener who is used to tonal music, this kind of music can be described as sounding gray. This piece, and the set it comes from, was the first published atonal piece by Schönberg, and there's no denying that it had serious repercussions for art music in general. But once again, we're not really talking about why we might find it to sound gray. We're merely justifying the musical experience with historical data, which we're told is important. I want to break that mold, which is certainly pervasive in much of contemporary music critique by audiences. So, let's talk about why there is no key center. In music, from the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th, there is an interesting increase of harmonic complexity that we see develop throughout history. While Mozart may stick to a home key, its dominant or subdominant, and maybe once in a while run over to the relative minor or major, he will never take the harmonic risks in terms of progression that Wagner or Scriabin might. This is not to say that Mozart's music is not complex, nor is it to say that Scriabin is better. It's simply an aesthetic situation where complexity of one communicative aspect is heightened and used as an expressive tool. For a moment, you have to understand contemporary music from the perspective of a composer who is attempting to say something new using a medium as rich and as explored as tonal music. For some time in the late 19th century, it was still possible to say the same thing as your predecessor, but using a more complex harmonic language and thus sound new. But eventually, given that we only have 12 notes in the chromatic scale, composers were mathematically bound to run out of options. But it's even worse than this. Traditional classical music functioned on the relationship between the tonic to the dominant and all other chords. If we're in C major, then our tonic is here. And our dominant is here. In order to indicate a tonic, composers would reinforce the tonic-dominant relationship near the beginning, so that the audience would have a frame of reference. The harmonic progression would probably be something like this. This helped the listener to understand later on when the piece was far away from the tonic, indicating a feeling of being far away from home, and when it was close to or resolving to the tonic, the feeling of coming home. In C major, these chords are relatively close to home. But chords like these seem further away. This perceptual distance is a significant expressive element in all tonal music, but it comes with a price. If the music is simple harmonically, then the distances are easily recognized and felt. If the music is too complex harmonically, then the distances blur into each other, with meaning sapped away from each. In other words, the more complex the harmonic language, the more difficult it was for the listener to hear the relationship between the tonic and other keys. This, in my view, is one of the main reasons Schönberg took the next logical step with this piece, to entirely remove a harmonic center, as it had finally become irrelevant and meaningless. The repercussions of removing tonality are logical and obvious when we stop to think about it. The first thing that disappears is a melody that we can easily hum. The opening gesture in single voice format is this. We could spend effort to memorize this, but even then, it would still be difficult to remember because the notes that play along with the so-called melody are not supportive harmony. So we can remember this, but when we try to remember the notes underneath, it gets confusing for our ear again. This is one of the main criticisms from first-time listeners to contemporary musical language, that they cannot remember the tune or leave the concert hall humming the melody. I understand this criticism, because from a first-time listener's point of view, they're looking for the thing that is most obvious to them in nearly all music they encounter. When they can't find it in contemporary music, they get frustrated and wonder what's going on. This disappearance of the most centrally important and expressive element to traditional classical music is compounded by another disappearance, that of a harmonic foundation. Consider this. The progression of 5-1, which is the foundation of nearly all art music before the 20th century, relies upon a single acoustical effect. When we establish a tonic key, like C major, and when we move to the dominant of C here, we feel like the dominant should resolve back to the tonic. It's a feeling of potential dissonance and a feeling of resolution to consonance. This is why no composer would ever end a large piece like this. In fact, if we just play this dominant seventh chord alone, we almost feel compelled to resolve it, and the feeling gets more desperate the longer we wait. There is definitely an emotional response component here. It hits us and influences us in a very direct manner. I will guess that that is why this is the fundamental core progression of all tonal art music. But as I said, this is only a guess. I need to take a moment for some full disclosure here. As of today, I have no idea if our perception of consonance and dissonance in tonal music is related to our experiences of music when we grow up, what kinds of music we listen to most frequently, or even if it's related to hard physical attributes of sound and construction of harmonic spectra. If we looked historically, we could trace the development of harmony from a single note line to double lines and octaves, then with a fifth added, and eventually a third. But these all fall under the Pythagorean system of division in an octave, and there are many cultures around the world that do not use our 12 semitone division. Maybe it's related to how we hear human voices. It's certainly something that we deal with from when we're very young, and even our ability to recognize a female voice from a male voice is dependent not on what we're looking at, but what harmonics and partials we hear in the sound. Maybe it's ingrained in us biologically to hear these divisions, and by extension, a concept of dissonance and consonance built on the octave and its divisions. But this is something that I do not think we have an answer to just yet. What is undeniable is that the concept of consonance and dissonance creates or evokes an emotional response in humans when we listen, and furthermore, it appears to be nearly universal. This is why it can be difficult to listen to contemporary music for the first time. Something that we take for granted simply doesn't exist anymore. So, we don't have melody and we don't have harmony. What is the audience supposed to listen to? Well, this is where we get back to the idea of gesture. I'll play you the opening once again, and when you listen to it, try to consider our previous discussion regarding how you have gestures that seem to close in on themselves and other gestures that seem to expand. When we remove tonality, the pitches themselves become supports for the gestures and not the melody. Let me say that again. In tonality, the pitches serve the dual purpose of being a part of the harmony as well as shaping a gesture using that harmony. In this piece, and with many others which have removed tonality, the pitches serve to show us the movement and direction of the gesture. They are supports for the gestures, and nothing more. If we compare the opening gesture with the second time we hear the idea, the pitches are different. We do not hear this in the traditional sense of the first one is in F major and the second is in B flat major. We hear it as, here's one gesture that closes in on itself, and here it is again, only slower and using lower pitches. the comparison base we use is from a less defined aspect. It's like comparing colors as opposed to comparing geometric shapes. We can say, this triangle has 3 sides and this square has 4. This would be tonal music. But in atonal, we'd probably say, this shade of green is darker than that one. Do you understand? This allows a tremendous amount of compositional freedom when we think about it. After the up the scale, down the scale gesture, Schönberg plays with the resonance of the piano, almost forcing us to recognize the relevance of the pitch to the note itself. He asks us to hold notes silently, raising the dampers without playing them. Then, he asks us to mark the same notes 2 octaves down. This starts the resonance of the silent notes in the right hand. When it's taken on its own, out of context, it's simply a musical effect, and one with very little value. But when it happens in the context of the piece, it presents another way of creating sound on the piano that does not involve an emphasis on pitch as a function of harmony or melody. It's simply sound that exists one moment and stops at another. Now, above all this, he gives us the familiar gesture, which eventually completes itself as the first gesture of the piece, now going lower in the compass than ever before. He finishes this little section off with the second gesture. If you'll remember, the second gesture is the expansion gesture that goes like this. Now this time he puts it a little lower and makes it a little more elaborate. Are you starting to understand how all this works? Listening to contemporary music requires us to essentially put on a new set of ears. It's like listening to poetry in a different language. If we don't understand the language, how on earth are we supposed to understand the subtle nuances in the poetry? The first step, in my view, is learning to perceive gestures and the value of gestures that have nothing to do with harmonic development or melodic beauty. Once we begin to see the shapes of sounds, rather than the pinpoints of consonance and dissonance, then we can move on to the next step of observing the shades within all these gestures that differentiates them. There is consonance and dissonance in atonal music, of course, but it does not necessarily exist on the plane of harmony primarily. It exists in all the other parts: gestures, articulation, rhythm, sound quality, all dependent upon the piece, of course. But we'll have to consider these other elements of expression in more episodes. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. As always, keep practicing, and remember to listen with different ears to contemporary music. It's a requirement, but it's well worth it. Bye for now.